Hello, AP World students. This is Mr. Everton. I'm sorry that I'm not there today. I'm out Monday through Wednesday, but we do have a test when I come back on Thursday and Friday. The test is going to be 25 multiple choice questions and one DBQ essay. So I'm going to review the unit. I'm going to review the topics that are covered by the test to try to help you review. I encourage you to take notes if that's helpful for you. And when you're done with the video, I have a DBQ for you to outline on Canvas, and then there's the Unit 8 progress check on AP Classroom. So let's go ahead and get started. We're talking about two topics, right? Unit 8 is about the Cold War, and it's also about decolonization. The Cold War, of course, is the 50-year period in which the United States and the Soviet Union are rivals. They're competing against each other to try to be the dominant superpower in the world. We're talking about a conflict, an ideological conflict between capitalism in the United States and communism in the Soviet Union. And both ideologies want to spread and, become global and take over the world. So they're at odds with each other, and this is made worse by the fact they both have nuclear weapons. At the same time, post-World War II, you have the independence movements in Africa and South Asia coming to fruition and allowing lots of new states to form. And so a lot of those new states are then put into this place where they're pressured to either side with the United States or the Soviet Union in the Cold War. I want you to make sure you remember the alliances. NATO is an alliance formed by the United States and its allies in Western Europe. And it's a military alliance, which, similar to other military alliances we've talked about in the 20th century, basically says that, if the Soviet Union were to attack any NATO ally, then it would be attacking all of NATO. So if it did anything against West Germany, then France and Great Britain and the United States would all get involved. A little while later, the Soviet Union created its own alliance system called the Warsaw Pact with its satellite states in Eastern Europe. And remember that a Soviet satellite state is a country in Eastern Europe that's part of the USSR's sphere of influence. It's a communist country that basically does whatever the Soviet Union wants. Okay, so, we've talked about empire a lot in our class. Empire has been the dominant form of government going back to the beginning of this class. We talked about the land-based empires. We talked about maritime empires that were established by European powers. And we talked about imperialism and the growth of those empires during the 19th century. After World War II, empires fall out of fashion. And no small part because the Nazis had imperial ambitions. They were trying to take over as much of Europe as possible in order to gain natural resources and land for the German people. And they were justifying this using racist beliefs about Jewish people and non-white people. And that's actually a more extreme version of what the British and the French and the Soviets and the Americans were all doing before anyway. Like they were taking over new places, taking over land to get access to resources and using racist beliefs in order to justify it. So another probably more important reason, though, that empire falls out of favor is that Europe is just too weak to have an empire anymore. Like London and all these major German cities and France were all decimated by the warfare that took place there. World War II was a total war, and it had a huge destructive impact on Europe. So now they have to rebuild with help from the Marshall Plan in the United States, but they can't really afford to maintain empires anymore. So after World War II, starting in 1945 and going up to about 1975, maybe a little bit later in some cases, you have European colonies in Africa and Asia gaining their independence. They're going to do this in a variety of ways. And when they gain their independence, there's going to be pressure, as I said a moment ago, for them to either become communist and side with the Soviet Union or become capitalist and side with the United States. And a number of them are going to instead pick a third way. They're going to try to stay out of it. They're going to join what's called the non-aligned movement. And, we talked about Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana trying to have Ghana be a non-aligned country. Sukarno in India and Nasser in Egypt both did the same. Probably the most successful is Nehru in India. We'll talk about that in a minute. A lot of these post-colonial states were the settings for proxy wars. And a proxy war is when the United States and or the Soviet Union fund and give political support and troops sometimes to aid somebody in a war of independence or a civil war in their country. And they do that in order to try to increase their own political influence. So the United States supported South Korea during the Korean War, gave money and troops to try to help South Korea become a unified non-communist Korea. Didn't exactly work. And then in the 80s, this other example I have pictured here, the United States gave money to try to fight against a communist group called the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and try to keep Nicaragua from becoming a communist country. So fighting against communism, but not fighting the Soviet Union directly. One of the ways that countries became independent during this time period was through armed struggle. We talked about the Vietnam War, which is another proxy war where the United States tried to send troops and money and weapons to stop Vietnam from becoming communist. Again, it did not work. Another armed struggle was in Cuba, where Fidel Castro and his communist movement overthrew a US-backed dictator named Batista in 1959. But another option for gaining independence was through negotiation, sitting around a table in a conference room with the colonizers and discussing the terms by which independence would be given. And examples of this, the big example is India, who's also got some examples of French colonies in West Africa and British colonies in West Africa. But also, my head is probably covering this up, but I want to remind you of the two organizations in India that, led to independence: the Indian National Congress, which was an Indian nationalist organization, which was led by Gandhi for much of the 20th century, and then the All India Muslim League, which was led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who you see pictured here with Gandhi's arm around him. Muslims in India were very concerned that they would not have a voice in an independent India, and so the All Muslim League and Jinnah advocated for India to be partitioned, divided into a Hindu India and a Muslim Pakistan, which happened. But these new borders created a lot of conflict, and the partition of India was incredibly violent, and there was a lot of death and destruction as Muslims left India and as Hindus left Pakistan. Similarly, there was a lot of violence and death in Palestine after it was partitioned in 1947 by the United Nations to create, an attempt to create two states, a Palestinian Arab state and a Jewish Israeli state. And there's been conflict there over that ever since. So the big idea here is that, formation of new states sometimes led to new borders and conflict. That's the idea. Okay. Another question is, when we have these new states, what are they going to do to solidify themselves? How are they going to improve themselves? How are they going to become modern, industrialized countries? And a really great example here is the video we watched on Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. And of course, he was trying to build this hydroelectric dam so that the electricity could be used to power the industrialization of Ghana and make it a modern country. And we saw in the video that what ended up happening was that Ghana didn't really benefit very much from the hydroelectric dam, that the neocolonialism of institutions like the World Bank and multinational corporations based in the United States ended up taking advantage of Ghana and profiting more from the dam than the Ghanaians did. Another example of a country that tried to modernize quickly is China. China was taken up with a civil war for much of the 20th century. In 1949, however, Mao Zedong declared it a communist country and set about trying to reimagine China and industrialize it quickly with his Great Leap Forward. Remember, the Great Leap Forward collectivized agriculture in China. Also, collectivization, remember, is when you take the land from private individual farmers and you create these big communal farms where everybody comes together and shares the work on the land. Also, tried to industrialize quickly by having people make steel in their backyards using these furnaces you see pictured here. And then there's also the Cultural Revolution, where he tried to redefine Chinese culture, trying to eliminate Western influences and also eliminate Confucianism, and trying to make China a more modern place that is authentically Chinese and not dominated by Western ideas. This was in many ways a failure. we talked about the destruction that happened because of the Great Leap Forward, where a lot of the steel that was made in these furnaces was unusable, and how the farming practices were poor and led to widespread famine, killing estimates of 20 million people. I also want to talk to you about resistance to state power. There's two kinds. There's peaceful, which is exemplified by people like Gandhi or like Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela that you see here, Nelson Mandela being from South Africa. Nelson Mandela, early in his life, and this was in the textbook, we didn't really talk about it in class. Nelson Mandela, early in his life, did engage in violent struggle to try to liberate South Africa, to liberate Black South Africans from their white apartheid government. Later in his life, he embraced peaceful protest and would go on to become the president of South Africa. There's also violent resistance to state power. So here we see Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden fought in the Soviet-Afghan war with the Mujahideen. And then afterwards, because of his anger at the United States for its support of Israel and his anger with the United States for stationing troops in Saudi Arabia, he founded the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda. And the whole point of terrorism is that you're attacking civilians. You're using violence against civilians in order to make a political point. So, Osama bin Laden couldn't take on the US military directly. He would lose. So instead, he fights a different kind of a war, trying to scare the United States into doing what he wants. Similarly, in Peru, there's an organization called Shining Path, which is a communist organization, a radical communist organization in Peru that fought a war in the 80s against, against civilians, again, using terrorist tactics to try to get their political goals to be successful. That's Shining Path in Peru. And then finally, the 1980s saw the end of the Cold War. Here you can see US President Ronald Reagan standing next to Mikhail Gorbachev, who was a leader of the Soviet Union, who introduced numerous reforms. The Soviet Union was struggling in the 1980s. Gorbachev instituted the reform of glasnost, which is openness, which means not censoring people, not cracking down on criticism of the government, trying to liberalize the country in that way. And then perestroika, which is to reform the economy and to make it not quite so strict a form of communism, open up the possibility for some trade and some private ownership of property. These reforms, along with the Soviet-Afghan war, really weakened the Soviet Union. And, he gave the people a little bit of freedom and they wanted more. This led to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. It also led to the democratization of Eastern Europe, where you have countries that had been under the influence of the Soviet Union, like East Germany, becoming reunified as a democratic Germany. One of the leaders of Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all these different countries that were part of the Soviet Union becoming democracies after the Soviet Union fell. So to sum up, I won't read this, but this is the big ideas that I put. These are the big ideas that I put on the screen at the very beginning of the unit. We're talking about the Cold War, and we're talking about decolonization, and we're talking about the ways that they're connected. I hope that this has been helpful for you. I will be back in class on Thursday and Friday. Feel free to send me an email. And good luck. I'll see you soon.